Welcome to Lab Life with the Air Force Research Laboratory.
Hi, I'm Michelle.
And I'm Kenneth.
Hello, folks. With the 20th anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks taking place this year, we spoke with Dr. Stacy Manni to discuss her experiences around the event and how it changed her career trajectory in the fields of chemistry and scientific diplomacy to aid the warfighter both at home and abroad.
In 3, 2, 1.
Dr. Manni, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm very excited about today.
Yeah, we're really fortunate to have you here today. And we wanted to kick off kind of looking back in time a little bit. You know, we're approaching the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. And we know that that was really a pivotal moment in your life and in your path. And you've been willing to kind of share your experience during that time with us.
Absolutely. So, yes, September 11th was an extremely pivotal moment, especially for my career, but also just, as a young person. I am from upstate New York, just outside of Albany. And the morning of September 11th, I was home preparing for a PT test. So I had joined the New York Army National Guard in order to help me pay for college. So I was a young person in New York at home, getting ready for a PT test. And that's when I saw the second plane hit the tower, and it became very clear immediately that this was not just some crazy, terrible accident. And that's when, things just totally changed. The phone rang, we were immediately activated, and we had to go to New York City. I was there to support deployments for what we thought were going to be recovery efforts. I had visited New York City a number of times during my life, but that experience will always stick in my head, just being on the streets and seeing these New Yorkers who are usually, full of energy and life and, busy, getting from place to place, just seeming so hollow and shaken and, almost zombie-like, people just stopping on the streets saying, thank you so much for being here, and like hugging you. I mean, it was surreal and so bizarre seeing all of the handmade or computer printed out posters of missing family members. That was so hard. So yes, that experience in New York City was extremely difficult those days. But then it led into a deployment to Kuwait and then Iraq. And so I spent almost 2 years in Kuwait and Iraq, and that was challenging, very challenging. It was between my junior and senior years of college, and going to a foreign country, a desert, being in a non-traditional war zone, meeting Iraqi nationals, and it was very difficult. It was very, very hard being there and interacting with people, especially after being so close to ground zero immediately after the terrorist attacks. It was immediately apparent that I was not made to be a soldier. I mean, I did my job to the best of my ability, made wonderful friends and all of that, but I knew that being a soldier was not going to be for me. And so when I returned, time was pretty much up, and I decided that while I may not be soldier material, I certainly loved soldiers. I loved them for their mission. I loved them for their fearlessness. And so out of college, I planned on working for the Army as a civilian, doing things that impacted soldiers in a way that was more suitable for me and my path.
I really appreciate you sharing a beyond challenging time in your life, even from a deployment as a guardsman and to being at ground zero, and reflecting with us now 20 years later. So you felt this call that I want to serve our soldiers. I want to serve our service men and women. So you had an interest in chemistry, and is that what you ended up working with the Army as a civilian for?
So I didn't get to work for the Army as a civilian. when I I was the unit's nuclear biological chemical officer. So I did, the mask fittings and talked a lot about the things that we would do in case of, some sort of a biological or chemical attack. And I did find it interesting, some of the countermeasures and things along those lines. And so those were areas that I was thinking about going into. But when it came time for me to, pick a career path, I had already found a love for chemistry. And I had applied to the SMART program. And so that's how I was picked up as a civilian. Initially, I was going to work in Maryland for a wonderful PI who, because of medical reasons, had to retire. And so I couldn't take that position in Maryland working on chemical warfare countermeasures. But there was a PI, a subject matter expert at Eglin, who was interested in my background. And so I pivoted and took a job with the Air Force. And so that's when I got into munitions and all of that, working in an amazing organization and not working for soldiers. And even sometimes now I'll slip up and call, our airmen soldiers, but, just working for the warfighter in different ways.
So I see that transition, and initially you thought you'd continue on with the Army, but through the SMART program, which a lot of really great minds in the lab have come to work through us through that scholarship and employment opportunity. It's pretty cool. But so then you land at the Munitions Directorate of AFRL at Eglin Air Force Base, and then what kind of work were you doing down there?
Well, one of the greatest things about the SMART program is while you're finishing, like in my example, my PhD, I got to go there for 2 summers just to, meet my future coworkers and just ease into and learn what everybody was doing. And so it was a wonderful experience. RW just kind of, gave me like a very small project to kind of get a feel for the things that they do. And so I would just go around and talk to, the different people who are working on different things and learn what they're looking at and why, and what is this munitions and what are the components and how does it, come together. And it was during that time that I started finding some of the areas that I found most interesting, scientific questions that weren't quite being addressed at the time, or some things that I just felt really passionate about.
And something that I'm kind of curious of too is working in the academic space, there's a lot of access to cool lab spaces and materials, but really if you go to the lab, it's truly state of the art in, well, every sense of the word. So what was it like for you to actually work alongside these experts and have access to these tools as opposed to what you may have had really only staying in academia?
Most of the characterization methods were pretty standard compared to academia, but in academia, it's all about doing the most that you can that has the greatest impact for a publication with like the least amount of money. Where in the Department of Defense, you're working towards a major goal, which has all of these steps from first principles to, small scale practice to large scale to building it up to sending it off to some company or to industry in order to do that part of the process. And so, but the experts that are available and, the ties that we had to like the Department of Energy and to the other labs, the Navy and the Army working alongside us. I mean, that was truly exceptional. And the people who have worked in the field for 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, at Eglin, there were people that have spent their entire careers studying like some fundamental part of that process. And so that was really amazing, just having access to them.
Yeah, I think you hit in a really important aspect, which it's not always just the materials or the lab space, it's the people. Like having access to these people who, like you said, could have been from academia, could have been from other labs, other services, wherever they may have come from. They have a wealth of experience that many books or teachers may not be able to fully express. So it's so cool you could work with, that brilliant team and then join it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the people, it's the people that make any place. They make places wonderful. They can make places challenging, but I had an amazing experience, especially for those internships. The people were just incredible. And the mission is incredible. It's so important, and having seen things from, a different perspective, not necessarily the same type of perspective as someone who would come directly through academia and then get a job in the lab, knowing that like these things that people are creating and studying and improving have direct impacts in the lives of our warfighters, keeping them alive and making sure they make it home.
And I'm glad you said perspective, because you had a very unique perspective in describing what you did. You told us that working in the munitions directorate and crafting munitions can be kind of like, or feel like, baking a cake. So and we thought that was very interesting. So can you walk through like that analogy and how it pertains to what you did specifically at Eglin?
Sure. So first of all, my husband is a chef. And so in the beginning, we talked a lot about how we pretty much do very similar things. He'll cook something and I'll do something in the lab, and it has a lot of the same types of steps. And I gave a talk at Purdue a few years ago where I compared formulating to, baking bread or baking a cake. And so you have some particulates, in my case, it would be energetic particulates or some sort of metal fuel. And in his case, it would be, like flour or different, dry ingredients. And then he would use, some binder material where we use polymers, and he'll use like eggs to bind everything together. And then, we'll use plasticizers in our materials in order to keep them soft and flexible, where he'll use water. And then, sometimes if he's working in a high humidity place, like we were in, say, Eglin, the panhandle can be very, very humid. He'd have to adjust the amount of water that he would add. And the same thing, we would have to adjust the amount of, the different components that we would add depending on what was going on in the environment. We had some ingredients that are sensitive to water, and so we would have to compensate for that. And it's funny, in the lab, when the processing team, they're making these energetic materials, they actually use these enormous mixers, like mixers that are used commercially for, baking. So, they throw the ingredients in, not throw. They very gently place carefully measured quantities of ingredients in. But I mean, they're these shear mixers that are used in the baking industry. So it really does feel and look kind of like baking a cake. And so there's a lot of science to it, but there's also a lot of art. There's a lot of, these people have had so much experience. This is going wrong. They know the little tricks in order to make the end product work out just right. And so, yeah, it is like baking a cake.
Man, now I'm picturing some like a giant KitchenAid just in a lab space at Eglin, KitchenAid mixer, and a bunch of the Betty Crockers of the munitions world, I guess. But anyway, I'm joking here. Yeah, and your team was really testing and developing new materials to help improve munitions. Could you tell us about that?
So my team looked at the surfaces and interfaces in munitions, but you could really apply it to any material, just about any material that is comprised of different components. For example, the cosmetic industry or the concrete industry or the pharmaceutical industry, they're all looking at the same kinds of things. Now, our end use and the specific things that we're more interested in are of course different, but the fundamentals are the same. We have particulates, and then we have, say, binder materials, and we have different additives, and we want to know, one, how do we measure these things? What's important? What's important at that interface? And what properties do we want? Do we want it to be really sticky so that that binder, interacts very strongly with what envelops it? Or do we not want that? Do we want it to be able to be just strong enough to mix up and create a material? And then later on, if there's insult or injury, do we want, that particle to separate from that binder? And so the first question was, what's important here? What measurements can we make, and then how do we make them? And then what does this mean? What does this scientific value mean from a chemistry perspective? But then also, a lot of the people who are working on these formulations for the warfighter are engineers. And so they're more focused and more concerned with, performance. Very important. But how do we move, this chemical calculation or this chemical principle or this chemical measurement. What does that mean? What does that mean for the formulator? So we also used a lot of mechanical properties testing in order to understand the performance metrics that we are comfortable with and we're familiar with. And then, novel modeling and simulation efforts to tie those two together so we can move closer towards a more predictive model. So we don't have to waste as much time and money building or, going through these iterations of these small scale tests. If we can understand, in the lab, a very, very small mixture that you just do by hand, you get these chemical properties, it'll likely result in these other properties for performance, just to move the formulation into a more predictive area, which would be really helpful when you're looking at, new energetic particulates or new additives, new binder systems, things like that.
That's great. I mean, thinking about that too, your team really ran the gamut of not only, like you said, testing and working with other experts to ensure these are safer to use, but something folks don't really consider is transporting munitions as well, whether that be to other locations for testing, overseas, wherever it's needed to keep people safe. And the fact that your team could help make sure it's safe for use and transport, I mean, that's a huge ask.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of people who look at, the safety of energetic materials. Our materials are secondary explosives. And so secondary explosives, you don't want them to be too sensitive. You want them to go off exactly when you want them to and not before. And we had people at Eglin whose sole job was to work with the Army and the Navy and to address sensitivity issues, to define sensitivity and to make sure that anything that left the final part of the process was safe to be handled by anyone. Because, mistakes happen. These munitions are very large at times, and, there are bumps and there are things that happen that you never want to put the warfighter at risk.
Another way, you've transitioned jobs since your time at Eglin, but you're still helping keep our warfighters safe in a different role. So now you work for the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, which is a part of the Air Force Research Laboratory, but specifically, AFOSR focuses on, basic research and funding and making sure we have this, like, the way I look at it, this pipeline of technology and innovation and knowledge that is going to move our laboratory and support to our warfighters forward. And what's really cool about AFOSR is that they have locations around the world, including one in Santiago, Chile, which is where we're talking to you from now. Unfortunately, Ken and I aren't there because that would be really cool because I've never been to Chile.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Someday, Ken, we're going to get down there. But so they call it SWORD, the Southern Office of Aerospace Research and Development. That's where you sit now. Did you ever imagine that you'd be working from Chile in your career in chemistry?
Never. When I was back in the lab, I heard a few years into my position that there was an office in Japan. And I was like, that is amazing. I want to work in Japan. Someday I'm going to make my way to the office in Japan. I didn't even know that there was an office in Chile because we're the newest office, although we're not that new. I think that the office opened up in 2009. I had been in the lab at RW for almost 10 years, and I was really thinking that I was ready for a change, and I wasn't sure exactly what that would look like. But there was a call from the chief scientist at RW, that the international offices were looking for people to do things. And I think that many subject matter experts or PIs who are in the lab, AFOSR is like our gold standard. It's where everybody, would like to work at some point because you are so influential in directing new projects, funding things. You really focus on a specific area and you just build these collaborations and relationships. So AFOSR has to be like the greatest job on the planet, in my opinion. But to also be able to do it from like a foreign country, I've always loved to travel. When I was in graduate school, I did a period of time at the National Institute for Material Science in Japan, and I loved it. But the SWORD office was looking for somebody to come down, and I had some background in Spanish, and in my opinion, Spanish is is an easier language to learn than Japanese. So, as a family, we decided that South America was where we would like to go. And so I applied. It took almost a year for me to get between that first contact to getting down here.
I mean, I can definitely agree. My wife took Japanese for a while in school. While it's a very fun language to learn, it's not easy, for sure. There's a lot of different written forms, a lot of different ways to speak and use the right kanji. You know it. So to hear you found a place that really fit more with, like, you knew Spanish and could make it work, I mean, that's great. And still, like you mentioned, in the international scene. So we'd love to hear them, what you're specifically doing in the office now, and if your your background in chemistry still kind of ties into it.
Absolutely. I mean, when you get your PhD, you learn about how to learn a new thing, a whole lot about it, a very specific niche thing, but you also learn how to look at the journal publications and the literature to learn new things. And so I've gone from being very, very, very narrow in the science that I'm working in to being extremely broad. So that was a little bit of an adjustment. My portfolio is chemistry, materials, and biological sciences. And so really anything can fit into my portfolio. I mean, just about anything that we are interested in doing can fit into there. But my job right now, we are not back in the office yet, unfortunately. So I've been working from home for a year and a half, just virtually meeting different PIs, getting to know the universities that are down here, just, working on building relationships, getting an understanding of who's doing what is the specialty in this area of the world or that area of the world, and things along those lines. Just being aware of what's happening so then we can start building collaborations, funding projects that are of interest to the Air Force, but mostly building collaborations, relationships, really.
Because you're really looking to connect. There's so many brilliant academics in Central and South America. So you're finding out what they're doing and seeing how they would align with Air Force and Space Force priorities in the future, and thinking like, wow, this person has an idea. If we build that relationship, maybe with the right funding or understanding of our mission, their research could evolve into something that will really, support our warfighters in the future.
Absolutely. And I just returned from a 2-week trip where I got to go to some of our research labs and meet a number of PIs and subject matter experts from like a broad range of areas, just so that I can get a better feel for, what are they working on? What is of interest? What is the state of the art? Where's there room for, us to fill some technology gaps? Do they have any collaborators, or do they know anybody who's done any work down here? So that when I come back and I make contact with, say, a new PI or a new university or department, and they ask, well, what are you looking to fund? I can tell them these are the specific things that we have interest in. These are like the small fundamental principles that can then be tied back into our TDs to meet some need or fill some gap. What we do is it's really like a force multiplier. The PIs back in the TDs, they don't have to directly do much other than let us know what they're looking for, perhaps provide some guidance as a subject matter expert or someone to bounce things off of with the PIs. And they can get as involved or not as they would like. It can become a true collaboration where materials are exchanged or, codes are exchanged, or they could directly interact on the objectives or the goals or the mission of whatever the project is.
And you really hit on a point that I wanted to check, but it sounds like, so if you find these researchers or find these experts in the field that really answer an Air Force ask, like you'd mentioned, it could be anything from biomaterials, working in chemistry, quantum, you name it. So the way you actually connect them then is you contact technical directorates, the AFRL or the PIs that saying, hey, I've been looking for this. You're like, well, I found your guy over here. And you're just the in-between that helps bring them in the room together to start the conversation.
Exactly. And it doesn't hurt that we have money to fund things, and people, are always willing to talk to people with money. So that we'll get white papers sent to us either by asking for them, or sometimes we'll just get white papers, and then we'll immediately try to find some TD expert who can help review them. And then we'll go through perhaps an iteration process where we ask the PI down here to clarify things or what have you. And then hopefully, we get to a point where we ask them to submit a proposal. And usually at that point, we have some transition idea in mind. We have somebody back at the lab who either gives their thumbs up, this is amazing, awesome, interesting research that could become something that could be applicable, or this is something that could be applicable now. I am always looking for bridging strong connections, whether we're using Windows on Science and we have one of the PIs from down here go up and give talks so that we can start to build that relationship, or what have you. Having that tech connection and perhaps a collaboration that lives much longer than the grant is really something that I get really excited about.
And for some of our listeners that might be newer to some of these terms, like PI, that means principal investigator, not private investigator, like Magnum PI or something. We got Tom Selleck's running around the world or something like that. He was Magnum PI, right? Or do I need to cut this joke out, Ken? I'm getting head nods. Okay, we're good, folks. And then white papers are just kind of like a general report or a synopsis of research that they might think might be relevant. Is that a fair assumption of what a white paper is?
Yes, very short, just a short idea of something that they would like to pursue.
And something pretty exciting that you're working on, Stacy, is there's this new workshop that's pulling together international teams to focus on chemistry, mechanics, modeling, and simulation, and more. What's going on?
So because of my background, I'm really passionate about the fundamental questions surrounding surfaces and interfaces. And I would like to bring that down here so that we can build some international collaborations, or we could just get a community of people together who are looking at these questions, who are focused on the answers, and who can push this area of research forward. While I may not be directly hands-on in this area anymore, just being involved still is very exciting. And so I've teamed up with RW with some really great researchers, and we put together a workshop that used all of our previous collaborations. So within the Department of Defense, so the Tri-Service, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and then our DOE, the Department of Energy partners, academia from the US, and then academia from all over the world. We had the Netherlands and Germany and the UK. We had some people from Mexico, from Brazil, from Argentina, and we all just got together and talked about, this is an important area, but what are the most important parts and pieces, and what should we be focusing on? And when we publish, what should we be publishing? So, the whole world can compare things. So we're comparing apples to apples. And so we're all just focused, in the same direction. And it's gone really, really well. And now we are trying to attach ourselves to the International Research Materials Congress, which occurs each year in Cancun, Mexico in August. And so there is a wealth of materials scientists in Mexico. And we do cover Mexico as well as Central and South America. And so it's really a great place for this workshop to live because it is truly international. It's not too far from, the TD lab, so we can get involved. It's a great place for us all to talk about, the fundamental principles, things that apply to all areas of materials. And then, we can kind of pull out our piece and modify it for our purposes. By being involved with, DOD and academia and all of these other people, we can kind of get ahead, all moving in the same direction without putting, a huge amount of money and time and effort to get there, because we're really at the fundamental level. How do we make these measurements? What's the best way? What properties are the most important? we are really at the beginning. And so this really creates a community where we can all share that knowledge and move this technology area forward.
And that really brings the AFOSR mission to a head in a lot of the AFRL missions, It's the idea that we want this international community to work together and have you and our experts out there finding these brilliant minds, brilliant people, brilliant technologies, and working with folks not even just in South America, but over in Tokyo, in London, like you mentioned, Germany, you name it. We have people here that have parts of the mission that we may not have considered, or like you said, are helping us work through different ideas that could really change it for their life for warfighters, civilians, and academia moving ahead. So to have something this big and so close to home in Cancun, that's big. That's really big.
Yes, I'm really excited about this one.
So speaking of being really excited, though, so you brought up a lot of cool terms before, like, again, the baking the cake analogy. And there's another term that you used that really resonated with me that kind of brings a lot of our conversation to a close, almost to a head, if you will. And that's this idea of scientific diplomacy. And that's kind of what your position feels like now. So can you kind of talk about what that means to you and why it's such an important tool within the international space?
So really everything that we do is scientific diplomacy. When a scientist talks to another scientist about their project, we just get excited. We get excited about the science, about the possibility. They're fun conversations. They're not conversations that require discussion of politics or any of the less pleasant aspects of, cross-cultural exchanges. Science to science discussions are easy and they're fun, but they also provide positive interaction. There are some PIs that have never worked with anyone from the United States. People might have preconceived notions about us. So just talking, building relationships, and, in the process of our normal job, funding grants and creating collaborations with our labs back home, creates these relationships and these feelings and these ideas, which can be felt long-term from a diplomatic standpoint. We are never going to outspend some other countries, but we can certainly, have lots of friendly, pleasant, scientifically important interactions, which can help in our diplomatic mission. And here in Santiago, Chile, we're actually co-located at the embassy. So we're here as diplomats with the Army and the Navy. So we do see a lot of the more diplomatic missions, and we do have 2 officers in our office who work almost exclusively, while they still are international program officers, they work pretty exclusively military to military, so working some of those higher level. But like at my level, I am just somebody that loves science, talking to other people who love science, regardless of, who is the new president in whatever country, or, what crazy things may be going on kind of around us. And it's fun and it's exciting to talk about science with people from other places and cultures. But it goes a long way.
Yeah, and we love science too, and this has been a lot of fun talking to you on the podcast and sharing your journey from the tough times to some of the highlights of your career. Probably now you would probably argue you have like one of the coolest jobs ever, which we hear a lot. But thanks for joining us today, Stacy, and we look forward to catching up with you in the future.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Make sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube at AF Research Lab. And remember, stay curious.
Logging off.